There is a story told by those who loved her, written down by her sister, and repeated across the century and a half, since that on the first day of June, 1879, a pressed violet fell out of Infanta Pilar's prayer book in Madrid. The flower broke at the stalk. Pilar would not learn until some weeks later why this particular day might have carried an omen. She could not have known, in that June moment, that in a shallow valley near the Itiotiosi River in the Natal region of southern Africa, the young man she had been promised to since childhood was fighting for his life and losing. That the Prince Imperial of France, Louis Napoleon, was dead by noon that day, pierced by assegai wounds from a Zulu ambush in a war that was not his, and a country that had no particular claim on his loyalty, except that he had been desperate to prove himself worthy of the name he carried, and there was nowhere else to prove it. When the news finally reached her that Louis was dead at 22, that the official visit to Madrid he had been planning on his return from South Africa would never now take place, that the marriage their mothers had been quietly arranging since the years of exile in Paris had ended before it could begin, Pilar's sister Paz noticed that her complexion had changed, that she seemed somehow lighter, and not in the way that implied relief. She outlived him by exactly 63 days. She was 18 years old. Her story does not fit any comfortable shape. It is too short to fit the shape of a life, too quiet to fit the shape of a tragedy, and too precise in its grief to be entirely dismissed as coincidence. It fits, in the end, only the shape of itself, a life of remarkable promise and remarkable pain, lived in the shadow of two fallen empires, and concluded in a small spa town in the Basque country, on a warm August night, while she was reading a novel and the doctor had not yet been sent for. Born in the palace. She was born on the 4th of June, 1861, at the Royal Palace of Madrid, the immense Baroque structure that sits at the western edge of the Spanish capital, above the Manzanares River, its stone facade extending across the landscape, with the particular grandeur of a building designed to convey the permanence of everything it housed. She was christened the following day with the full weight of Spanish royal tradition: Maria del Pilar Berenguela, Isabel Francisca de Assis Cristina, Sebastiana Gabriela, Francisca Caracciolo Saturnina. She would be called Pilar. Her mother was Queen Isabella II, who was at that point in the 38th year of a life that had been, from its very first months, constitutionally turbulent. Isabella had become Queen of Spain at the age of 3, upon the death of her father, King Ferdinand VII, who had revised the laws of succession specifically to allow his daughter to inherit, rather than permitting the throne to pass to his brother Don Carlos. This revision had been contested violently, repeatedly, and at great cost in Spanish blood, through the Carlist Wars that had structured the political landscape of Isabella's entire childhood and adolescence. She had been declared of age at 13, crowned, manipulated, married against her will, and had spent the subsequent decades navigating the competing demands of military politicians, conservative courtiers, revolutionary liberals, and her own formidable appetites, with a result that was, by any measure, a reign of near-permanent crisis. The marriage into which Pilar was born was not a marriage in any meaningful sense beyond the legal. Isabella had been required, at 16, to wed her cousin, Francisco de Assis, Duke of Cadiz, a man whom the Queen regarded from the first with a contempt she made very little effort to conceal. Isabella's own description of her wedding night, preserved in a remark she made in later life, was characteristically direct. "What shall I say of a man who wore more lace than I?" Francisco was widely considered effeminate, timid, and altogether unsuited to the role of consort to a queen of Isabella's particular temperament. He moved out of the royal apartments almost immediately after the wedding ceremony. His wife moved on to other remedies. Francisco's biological paternity of the various children born during this marriage has been, to put it diplomatically, a matter of sustained historical discussion. He recognized every child as his own. The question of who their biological fathers actually were has occupied biographers of the Spanish Bourbons with considerable persistence ever since. For Pilar specifically, the most frequently assigned biological father is Miguel Tenorio de Castilla, a diplomat and politician 12 years Isabella's senior, who arrived at the court of Madrid in April 1859 as secretary to the Queen, serving her with what contemporaries described as loyalty and efficiency, and with what subsequent historians have described as rather more intimate devotion. He was a widower, with an established political career and a private relationship with the Queen that lasted from 1859 until 1865, when he was dismissed from his post by a government that had grown uneasy with his influence. The three youngest daughters of Isabella II, Pilar, Paz, and Eulalia, are frequently attributed to his paternity. Francisco, for his part, declared Pilar his favourite among all the children of the marriage, and the one to whom he felt closest. The irony of this, if the attribution is correct, was one that those who kept court secrets were not inclined to examine too closely. Whatever the circumstances of her conception, the child who arrived in the royal palace of Madrid in June 1861 was a princess of Spain, third in the line of succession, sister to the heir apparent Alfonso, and possessed of a particular quality that those who knew her in childhood described with consistent warmth. Pilar was, from an early age, the kind of person whose presence others remembered, not because she was loud or demanding, as might be expected of a royal child of her generation, but because she had the opposite quality, a quietness, a warmth, a capacity for genuine connection with people around her that was, in the formal atmosphere of the Spanish court, something unusual enough to be remarked upon. Her sister Paz, who would be her closest companion for the whole of her short life, wrote about her in later years with a love that time had not diminished. Everyone, wrote Paz, loved Pilar best of all. Until the age of 4, she was raised, in accordance with Spanish royal custom, by a wet nurse who had been carefully chosen. At 7, her formal education was placed under the supervision of the Duchess of Berwick and Alba. She was growing up in the gilded, stifling world of a court that was perpetually on the edge of crisis, in a family whose political situation was deteriorating month by month, at the side of a mother whose own position was becoming impossible to sustain. In the summer of 1868, when Pilar was 7 years old, the royal family was at Lecatio, on the Cantabrian coast, where the Queen had been prescribed sea bathing for a skin condition. Pilar's closest companions were her sisters Paz, 1 year younger at 6, and Eulalia, 4 years old. Their brother, Alfonso, 10, was being educated separately as heir to the throne. Their eldest sister Isabella had been married off in May to their cousin Prince Gaetan, Count of Girgenti, and was abroad on her honeymoon. The arrangement of the older children's lives had a deliberate quality, the heir educated for his future, the eldest daughter disposed of in marriage, the middle children gathered into the maternal orbit. This was the world Pilar knew, her mother, her sisters, the particular intimacy of siblings who are each other's primary company in a household where the adults are occupied with crises. On the 28th of September, 1868, the royalist forces of General Novaliches were defeated at the Battle of Alcalá. The defeat was decisive. 2 days later, the Queen of Spain and her children crossed the border into France by train. As Isabella's carriage passed through the border station, a crowd of returning exiles jeered from the platform. "Down with the Bourbons! Long live liberty! Long live the Republic!" The 7-year-old Infanta would have heard them. The world of the Royal Palace of Madrid, of formal audiences and court ceremony, and the particular dignity of a life lived at the centre of a monarchy, all of it was over, as suddenly as the seasons change, on that September day. What lay ahead was something none of the children had any preparation for, and no particular reason to expect. Years of exile, years of uncertainty, and an education in the particular discipline of carrying a royal name with nowhere to put it. The years in Paris. The first home of the deposed Spanish royal family in France was the Château de Pau, a Renaissance castle close to the Spanish border, the birthplace of Henry IV of France, whose blood flowed through Pilar's veins, as through the veins of most European monarchs of her generation. Napoleon III, who was still emperor, and whose own magnificent structure had not yet shown its cracks, provided the castle as temporary accommodation. It was picturesque and uncomfortable in equal measure, and the family stayed no more than a month before Queen Isabella made the decision that would define the next years of her children's lives. They would settle in Paris. The Palace of Castile, a great house near the Arc de Triomphe on the Avenue du Roi de Rome, renamed from its original title of Palazzo Basilewski, became the home of the Spanish royal family in exile. It was a household of considerable grandeur by the standards of most European citizens, and of considerable modesty by the standards of what it had replaced. The Queen, who had reigned over 35 years of turbulent Spanish monarchy, was now a private person, dependent on her own resources and the goodwill of the French emperor whose hospitality she was accepting. Her children, who had grown up in the royal palace of Madrid, with all the formality and distance that institution required, were now something slightly different. They were girls at school. Pilar, Paz, and Eulalia were enrolled at the Sacré-Cœur, the College of the Sacred Heart, in the Rue de Varennes. It was a Catholic school run by nuns, one of the most prestigious educational establishments available to girls of their class in Paris, and it was a genuine school in a way that their previous education in the royal palace had not been. The three infantas attended daily from the Palace of Castile, living as weekly boarders in effect, returning home each evening. French became their first language with remarkable speed, the fluency of children who are fully immersed in a language before the age of 10. They became, in the years of the Paris exile, genuinely cosmopolitan in a way that Spanish royal children of their generation rarely achieved. They met people from across Europe. They moved through the social world of the imperial capital with a freedom that no life in the confines of the royal palace in Madrid could have provided. And it was in Paris, in the years between 1868 and 1871, that Pilar was sometimes invited to the Tuileries Palace to play. The Tuileries was the imperial residence of Napoleon III and his Empress Eugénie, the other great Spanish woman at the center of French imperial life, whose own story was bound to the Queen of Spain's by a thread of personal friendship that would ultimately tie their children's fates together in ways neither woman could have anticipated. The Empress Eugénie was herself a Spaniard-born Maria Eugenia Ignacia Agustina de Montijo in Granada in 1826, raised between Spain and France, and married to Napoleon III in 1853 inches, a union that had surprised and slightly scandalized European court opinion, which considered a Spanish countess of uncertain lineage somewhat beneath the dignity of the Emperor of the French. Eugénie had answered this objection with the particular elegance of a woman who has considered it and found it insufficient. At the Tuileries, Pilar and her sister were sometimes invited to play with Eugénie's son, Louis Napoleon, Prince Imperial, known within the family as Loulou. He was 5 years older than Pilar, born in 1856, the carefully tended, adored, single child of two parents who had found the business of producing him sufficiently difficult that they did not attempt it again. He was, by every account that survives, a young man of exceptional personal quality, charming, physically graceful, possessed of a natural dignity that made even those who opposed his father's politics think twice. He had his mother's Spanish warmth and his father's ability to make a room feel, simply by entering it, like somewhere worth being. He spoke Spanish as well as French, which mattered to the little Infanta who had not yet fully replaced her first language with her second. They played together in the gilded rooms of the Tuileries. Pilar was 9 or 10, he was 14 or 15. The connection was light, as childhood connections are the kind that leave a residue that later life either builds upon or dissolves, depending on what circumstances intervene. What intervened was catastrophe. On the 2nd of September, 1870, the French Emperor surrendered to the Prussians at the Battle of Sedan. The Second French Empire, which had seemed so permanently installed in the fabric of European life, dissolved with a speed that left everyone who had trusted in its permanence slightly stunned. 4 days later, the Third Republic was proclaimed in Paris. The Empress fled the Tuileries through a side entrance as the mob was at the front, was driven through the streets of Paris by a trusted friend, and eventually reached England by boat. The Emperor followed into exile when the Prussians released him. Louis Napoleon, the Prince Imperial, went with his mother. He was 14, Pilar was 9. She and her family were forced to leave Paris, as the Commune's violence convulsed the city. They spent a year at the Hôtel de la Paix in Geneva, before returning to a Paris whose political surface had calmed, but whose interior, decorations in the Palace of Castile, had been destroyed by its use. As a hospital during the siege, Pilar returned to the Sacré-Cœur. In November 1871, her brother-in-law, the Count of Girgenti, the husband of her eldest sister Isabella, shot himself in a Paris hotel room. He had been suffering from what those around him described as severe depression for years. Another death in a family that was accumulating grief at a rate disproportionate to its already substantial store. In 1873, During a visit to Rome, Pilar and her sisters received their first communion from the hands of Pope Pius IX, an occasion whose significance within the devout world of the Spanish Bourbons cannot be overstated. The faith that would sustain Pilar through the difficulties of the years ahead was, in this Roman ceremony, formally committed to. She was becoming, through these years of exile, a particular kind of young woman, educated beyond what the Spanish court of her childhood would have produced, fluent in multiple languages, exposed to a wider world than most princesses of her generation encountered, and possessed of a quality of inner composure that those around her attributed to her natural character. But that may also have been the discipline acquired by a girl who has watched her world collapse and learned, in consequence, to locate her stability somewhere less susceptible to political upheaval. The year that would change everything arrived at the end of December 1874, when a military coup in Spain, the pronunciamiento of General Martínez Campos, ended the First Spanish Republic and restored the Bourbon monarchy to the throne. Isabella II's son, Alfonso, was proclaimed King Alfonso XII of Spain. He was 16 years old. The dynasty was back. The exile was over, or almost over. Pilar was 13. The return and the promise. The return to Spain was not a simple thing. The government of Prime Minister Cánovas del Castillo, which had managed the restoration with considerable political skill, had not managed it in a way that assigned any role to the former queen. Cánovas was explicit on the point. Isabella's presence in Spain would be an embarrassment to the new order rather than an asset. She was told, with the bluntness of a man who had decided the matter and was not open to revision, that Spain needed a new era. She could visit, she could not remain. Her son was the king, she was the king's mother. These were not the same thing. Alfonso arrived in Spain in January 1875. His sister, Isabella, Princess of Asturias, followed in March. Pilar, then 13, remained in France with her mother and her two younger sisters. Not until the summer of 1876, after almost 8 years in exile, was the family permitted to return even partially. They arrived by sea, landing at Santander on the 30th of July, 1876. Pilar had turned 15 the previous month. The homecoming was, by the accounts of those present, both emotionally overwhelming and politically muted. King Alfonso came to Santander to meet them, but left the same evening. The political sensitivity of Queen Isabella's presence in Spain, her complicated relationship with the government, her inability to be in Madrid, the careful management of her public appearances meant that the reunion that Pilar might have hoped for was something more constrained and conditional. They were in Spain, but Spain had reorganized itself without them, and the spaces it had left for their return were smaller than the spaces they had once occupied. For almost a year, between November 1876 and September 1877, the family lived at the Alcazar of Seville, the ancient Moorish palace that had served as a royal residence since the Reconquista, whose gardens and chambers carried the weight of Spanish history in every carved archway and tiled courtyard. King Alfonso visited at Easter 1877, and it was there that the family encountered the development that would alter the emotional landscape of everyone connected to the Spanish crown that year. Alfonso had fallen in love with their cousin Mercedes of Orléans, the daughter of the Duke of Montpensier, and wished to marry her. His mother was bitterly opposed. The Duke of Montpensier was the man who had spent a considerable fortune helping to depose her in 1868, and Isabella's feelings about this were expressed with the directness that characterized her emotional life generally. She would not support the marriage. She found the whole situation intolerable. She returned to Paris, November 1877. Pilar never saw her mother again. It was in this period, the autumn of 1877, when Pilar moved to the royal palace of Madrid to live under the supervision of her eldest sister, that the question of her own marriage became a matter of genuine political urgency. Spain's line of succession was precarious. King Alfonso had no children by his first cousin and wife Mercedes, whom he married in January 1878 at the Basilica of Nuestra Señora de Atocha. Pilar attended the wedding, close to the cousin who had become her sister-in-law, glad for her brother's happiness. Mercedes was, by every account that survives, a young woman of real charm and genuine warmth, a quality that made what happened next all the more difficult to absorb. Mercedes died in June 1878, 6 months into the marriage. She had suffered a miscarriage, and the grief of it had weakened her beyond recovery, and she died of gastric fever at 17. Madrid wept. Alfonso was inconsolable, and Pilar, who had attended the wedding in January and was now watching her brother move through grief in the summer heat of Madrid, was still without a husband and still third in line to a throne with no direct heir. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. In the dynastic arithmetic of 19th century European monarchy, the grief of a dead sister-in-law and the grief of a country watching its king mourn were, in the calculation of those responsible for the succession, inseparable from the question of who Pilar would marry. The urgency was real. The candidates were being considered. Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria was one. He came to Spain on a hunting expedition, met Pilar. He was surprised to find that she was blonde with clear eyes rather than the brunette he had apparently expected all Spanish women to be, concentrated primarily on the game hunting, and showed no particular interest in marriage negotiations. The Austrian match came to nothing, and then Empress Eugenie's name entered the conversation again. It had always been there, in truth. Since the years of exile in Paris, when 2 women, a deposed Spanish queen and an empress in temporary residence, had found each other's company sustaining, there had been an idea between them that their children might one day marry. Queen Isabella and Empress Eugenie were both Spaniards in France, both mothers of only sons and daughters, both bound by the particular solidarity of women whose public lives had placed them in situations that left them, in private, with relatively few people who could understand what those situations actually felt like. The idea of a marriage between Pilar and Louis Napoleon, the Spanish Infanta, and the French Prince Imperial was a natural expression of that friendship, a way of binding the 2 dynasties together and of giving both women's children something that the political circumstances of their birth had denied them: a stable home in a settled future. The project had been on what the diplomats of the period called the back burner, present but not actively pursued, waiting for conditions to improve. Louis Napoleon was living in England, training at Woolwich as a British Army officer. The Bonapartist restoration remained a possibility that its supporters worked toward with genuine commitment and occasional optimism. A marriage between the son of the French pretender and the sister of the King of Spain would have been, in that political context, a statement of some weight. But it was more than a political project for Pilar. Those who knew her in this period, the spring and early summer of 1879, understood that she had been hoping to marry Louis since they were children together in the Tuileries. The connection had never entirely dissolved, whatever distance and circumstance had intervened. He was due to pay an official visit to Madrid on his return from South Africa. They were expecting to see each other. The future, for the first time in Pilar's careful and contingent life, had a particular shape. The shape of a person who was coming to meet her. He was killed on the 1st of June, 1879, in the Itiotiosi River Valley in Zululand by a Zulu ambush on a reconnaissance patrol. He was 22 years old. He had been carrying his great-uncle Napoleon Bonaparte's sword, and from that moment, from the press of 18 assegai wounds in African earth, from the failure of a horse named Fate to stand still long enough for its rider to mount the life that Pilar had been quietly, patiently building toward, dissolved, with a completeness that even those who loved her best had not anticipated. The long cost of waiting. To understand what the death of the Prince Imperial meant to Pilar, it is necessary to understand what the years that preceded it had already extracted from her. She had been 7 years old when her family was driven from Spain. She had spent her most formative years, the years in which character consolidates, in which the world establishes itself as something reliable or unreliable in a condition of displacement. The Paris exile was, by the standards of exile, remarkably civilized. They had money, comfort, education, and the social world of one of the most brilliant cities in Europe. But the Palace of Castile was not the royal palace of Madrid. The Sacré-Cœur was not the Spanish court. And the question that underlies every exile's existence, when can we go home, and what will home be when we return, was present for Pilar throughout the years of her education, the years of her formation, the years in which she was becoming herself. She had returned to Spain in 1876, only to find that Spain had rearranged itself in ways that left the returning royal family slightly peripheral to its own story. Alfonso was king, but the government managed him. Isabella was his mother, but she was not permitted in Madrid. Pilar moved to the royal palace of Madrid, but she moved there under the supervision of her eldest sister, a young woman herself, managing 3 younger siblings in a wing of a palace separated from the adult spaces where decisions were made. She had watched her brother grieve for Mercedes through the summer of 1878, and had understood, with the particular sensitivity of someone who has spent years watching the people she loves navigate loss, that grief of that quality changes a person. Alfonso would eventually remarry. He would choose the Archduchess Maria Cristina of Austria, a steady and capable woman who would prove an excellent queen consort, though the marriage was built on political calculation rather than the kind of feeling that had animated the first one. The court Pilar inhabited was not a joyful one. It was a court in the process of recovering from loss and reorganizing itself for an uncertain future. And through all of this, through the exile, the return, the political constraints, the dynastic anxieties, Pilar had been patient. She had been patient in the way that quiet people learn to be patient, which is to say that the patience was not passive but actively maintained, a daily choice to continue trusting that the life she was waiting for would eventually arrive. She had the faith of her Bourbon upbringing, the faith confirmed in that Roman ceremony with Pope Pius IX, the faith of a woman who had been raised to believe that suffering has purpose and that what is endured well is endured toward something. What she was enduring toward was the visit to Madrid, the arrival of the young man she had played with in the Tuileries, who was now an officer in the British Army and a prince in exile, and the most serious matrimonial prospect available to the Spanish throne. The visit planned for his return from South Africa, an official engagement that would have been, in its private dimensions, something much more particular than official visits usually are. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. In the months between the death of her sister-in-law Mercedes in June 1878 and the death of the Prince Imperial in June 1879, Pilar had been the most politically useful unmarried royal in Spain, and also the most personally hopeful. Those two facts rarely coincide so neatly, and the coincidence, when it dissolves everything it has supported. Infanta Paz, who was with her sister through this period and who wrote about it afterwards with the careful precision of grief, noticed that Pilar looked pale and tired in the weeks after the news of the Prince Imperial's death arrived. She did not write about it to their eldest sister in Madrid because she did not want to alarm Pilar by making the observation official. She watched and waited and hoped the pallor would lift. It did not lift. The last summer, in the early summer of 1879, the decision was made that Pilar, Paz, and Eulalia would spend some weeks at Escoriaza, a small town in the Basque province of Gipuzkoa that was known for its hot springs and mineral waters. Such spa visits were, in the medical understanding of the period, precisely the remedy for the kind of exhaustion and pallor that Pilar was showing a restorative interlude in a place of clean air and simple pleasures. Away from the pressures of the palace and the formalities of the court, they arrived on the 10th of July, after a long and tiring journey. In the weeks that followed, the 3 sisters established a simple, gentle routine: walks in the countryside surrounding the town, reading, the ordinary sociability of a small place that was unexpectedly hosting royalty and managing the situation with provincial warmth. Escoriaza was not Madrid or Paris or Seville. It had none of the complex machinery of court life. It was a place where a pale and grieving young woman could, if not recover, at least rest. Pilar and Paz read together. They walked, they rested. They were, by the account Paz wrote years later, happy in the modest, uncomplicated way that is available to people who have agreed for a season to ask very little of the world. Paz noticed the pallor but said nothing. She also noticed that her sister was reading Graziella, the novel by Alphonse de Lamartine, published in 1852, which is essentially a story of love and loss, in which a young woman dies of grief for the man she cannot have. It is a particular choice of reading material for a young woman in Pilar's situation, and whether it represented an unconscious identification or simply the literary tastes of a girl educated at the Sacré-Cœur in Paris, it has been noted by every biographer who has written about these final weeks. On the 1st of August, 1879, The people of Escoriaza arranged a small festival in the Infanta's honor. It was a rustic, good-hearted occasion, the kind of celebration that small communities produce for visiting royalty when they wish to show genuine affection without the means for anything more elaborate. Pilar wore a white dress and a red beret, and attended with the gracious ease that had always characterized her dealings with ordinary people. There were donkey rides and bullocks and open-air dancing. She danced. She accepted the warmth of the people around her with the natural directness that her sister Paz had always identified as the quality that made people love Pilar first. That night, she said she felt tired. On the 3rd of August, she did not feel well and remained in bed all day. That night, she was reading. The book was Graziella. The room was quiet, and the Basque summer dark had gathered at the windows, and her sisters were near. And then, without announcement, without the warning that illness usually provides, without the gradual descent that would have allowed for the doctor to be summoned and the family to be gathered, she had an acute attack of convulsions, lost consciousness, and did not recover it. Infanta Maria del Pilar of Spain died on the 5th of August, 1879, at Escoriaza. She was 18 years old. The official medical report described the cause as serious effusion. The more probable diagnosis, in retrospect, is tuberculous meningitis, a condition that can produce exactly the pattern of symptoms Paz had been quietly observing across the preceding weeks: pallor, fatigue, a gradual withdrawal of the light that had always been present in her sister's face. It is a death that arrives quickly at the end of a long, quiet approach. Her brother King Alfonso and her eldest sister Isabella arrived at Escoriaza too late to see her alive. The distance from Madrid to the Basque country was not, in the Spain of 1879, quickly covered. By the time they reached the town, the Infanta was already being prepared for her burial. She was taken to El Escorial, the great monastery palace at the foot of the Guadarrama Mountains that serves as the burial place of the Spanish royal family. She was laid in the Pantheon of the Infants, the vault for members of the royal family who died before their time, who never reigned, who hold their title into death without ever having the opportunity to convert it into anything more. The Pantheon of the Infants is not the Pantheon of the Kings. It is where Spain keeps its might-have-beens. From Camden, England, where she was living in the quiet exile of her widowhood, Empress Eugenie wrote to her mother, the Countess of Montijo, on the 9th of August, 1879. I have received a terrible blow with the death of Infanta Pilar, who was so close to my son. You tell me that she felt sick after a dance in Escoriaza. Could God have truly decided to take these two souls destined one to another? She took one of the wreaths from her son's burial and sent it to Pilar's grave at El Escorial. The Empress, who had carried her own loss, the loss of her only son, on whom the entire future of the Bonaparte dynasty and 2 decades of devoted maternal preparation had rested, reached across her grief to acknowledge someone else's. The wreath from Louis's burial placed at Pilar's grave. Violets, perhaps, the flower of the Bonapartes. The flower that had broken in Pilar's prayer book on the day he died. What those who loved her said. The death of an 18-year-old rarely produces the kind of sustained public response that the deaths of older, more publicly established figures produce. Pilar had not reigned. She had not governed, had not built anything, had not left the kind of visible legacy that history typically requires in order to sustain attention across time. She had been a princess in exile, a sister in a palace, a young woman reading a novel in a spa town in the Basque country on an August night. The world noted her passing, offered its condolences to the Spanish royal family, and moved on. But those who had known her spoke about her differently from the way that official condolences speak. Infanta Paz, who would later marry Prince Ludwig Ferdinand of Bavaria and would name her only daughter Pilar in her sister's memory, introducing a Spanish name into the Wittelsbach dynasty for the first time, wrote about her eldest sister with a specificity and a tenderness that decades of distance did not diminish. Everyone, Paz wrote, loved Pilar best of all. The statement is simple and absolute, and it carries within it the full weight of grief that simple, absolute statements about the dead always carry. Francisco de Assis, the nominal father who had regarded Pilar as his favorite among all the children of the marriage, received the news of her death with a grief that those who observed him found disproportionate only if they did not know how much she had meant to him. He outlived her by 23 years, dying in 1902. King Alfonso, Pilar's brother and the king whose restoration had brought the family back from exile and whose own grief for Mercedes, for the friend who had been his sister, was layered now with another loss. They continued his reign until his own early death in November 1885, at the age of 27, from tuberculosis. His second wife, the Queen Regent Maria Cristina, governed Spain with remarkable steadiness until his son Alfonso XIII came of age. The dynasty survived. It continued without Pilar in the ways that dynasties always continue, without their particular members closing the gap she had left, as dynasties do, by filling space rather than replacing persons. Empress Eugenie lived until 1920. She was 94 years old. She outlived her husband, her son, the empire they had built together, the century in which all three had seemed so permanent, and one world war whose scale and violence would have been unimaginable to the woman who had danced in the Tuileries when the Second French Empire was at its most brilliant. She built an abbey at Farnborough in Hampshire and had her husband and son's bodies transferred there so that she could be buried beside them. She spent the last 40 years of her life as the living monument to everything she had lost. She was, by the time she died during a visit to her native Spain in the summer of 1920, the last significant survivor of the world, that Pilar had been born into the world of the Second French Empire, of the Spanish court of Isabella II, of the gilded and turbulent years when it had seemed possible that all these arrangements might last. The violet that is said to have broken in Pilar's prayer book on the 1st of June, 1879, belongs to the category of stories that resist definitive verification, and even more definitively, resist being entirely dismissed. Pilar's sister Paz recorded the legend. Empress Eugenie's letter confirmed that the two young people were understood, by those closest to them, to have been destined for each other. The timing of the deaths, 63 days apart. 2 months. The period between one young person's ambush in a Zulu valley and another's convulsions in a Basque spa town carries within it the particular quality of coincidence that is too precise to be comfortable and too imprecise to be proof. What the historical record does confirm is the wreath. Eugenie took it from her son's grave and sent it across the Channel and across the length of France to a girl's grave in the mountains near Madrid. The gesture required more than courtesy. It required the recognition that the two griefs, the mother's and the infanta's, belonged to the same story, that the two deaths were connected in some way that the bureaucratic vocabulary of official condolence could not quite contain. What remains? Return now to the prayer book and the violet. The 1st of June, 1879, the flower that broke at the stalk. We know now everything that happened after that day, everything that the pressed violet could not have known, and that Pilar would spend the following 63 days not yet knowing. The death in the Itiotiosi Valley, the 18 assegai wounds. The body found the following morning, returned to England for burial at Chislehurst, Queen Victoria's cross erected on the site. Empress Eugenie's pilgrimage to Zululand the following year to see for herself the place where her son had fallen. We know now that the visit to Madrid that Louis Napoleon had planned on his return from South Africa never happened. That the marriage, which had been quietly, carefully arranged between two exiled mothers who had found in each other's company something like genuine friendship, was ended by a strap that broke on a horse's saddle in an African river valley. That the shape of Pilar's future, which had, finally, in the spring of 1879, acquired the particular clarity of a thing about to become real, dissolved on the same day that the violet fell out of the prayer book and broke at the stalk. The question that hovers over Infanta Pilar's 18 years is not a complicated one. It is simply this: what is the cost of living at the intersection of dynastic obligation and personal feeling, in a world that treats those two things as the same when it suits the dynasty and treats them as entirely separate when it does not? She was born to be useful. She was born as a princess of Spain, third in line of succession, a piece on the board of European dynastic politics that her mother and the Spanish government would move when the moment required it. She was promised to a prince she had played with in childhood, not because anyone had asked whether she wanted this, but because it was politically convenient and dynastically sensible and personally, as it happened, true to what she actually felt. The fact that the political project and the personal feeling aligned was a fortunate accident, not a policy. The distinction matters. The irony at the center of her story is that the exile, which seemed like the worst thing that could happen to her, the loss of the palace, the years in Paris, the education at the Sacré-Cœur, in a language that became more familiar than her own, was also the thing that produced the connection she was mourning. She would never have known Louis Napoleon at all if both their families had remained in their respective palaces. The Tuileries and the Royal Palace of Madrid are not close neighbors. It was the coincidence of two exiled dynasties in Paris, two Spanish mothers sustaining each other in reduced circumstances, that created the childhood in which she played with him and the adulthood in which she was waiting for him. The exile made her, and the exile made the loss. Her sister Paz named her daughter Pilar. The name entered the house of Wittelsbach, foreign to it and carried there by grief, the particular kind of memorial that a surviving sister makes when no other memorial is available, when the person being remembered left nothing behind that can be pointed to, except the impression she made on the people who knew her best. Pilar of Spain is remembered by those who know anything about her, which is not many people, and not for long, given the brevity of her life and the smallness of her surviving footprint as the Infanta who died of a broken heart. The medical diagnosis is tuberculous meningitis. Both may be true simultaneously. The body knows what the spirit has been told. Empress Eugenie wrote, "Could God have truly decided to take these two souls destined one to another?" The question has no answer that will satisfy everyone who reads it. What it has is the full weight of a woman who has buried her son and is now being asked to absorb the news that the girl he was coming home to marry has also died, and who finds that the two losses added together produce something that the language of condolence is not quite adequate to express. At El Escorial, in the pantheon of the infants, the marble is cool and the names are carved carefully, as names always are when they are all that remains. Pilar's name is there. She is where the Spanish royal family puts its unfinished stories, the children who did not reign, the young who did not grow old, the members of the dynasty who belonged to it, without ever being required to demonstrate that belonging through the accumulation of a public life. She had a prayer book. She had a pressed violet. She had a younger sister who loved her, and a novel she was reading on the night that the convulsions came. She had 63 days of not knowing what the 1st of June had taken from her, followed by one dance in a white dress at a rustic festival in a small Basque town, followed by tiredness. She was 18. She was, by the testimony of everyone who knew her, the one they all loved best. And the world she left behind, the deposed empresses and the restored monarchies, and the great European dynasty games of the 19th century, went on without her, as worlds always do, rearranging itself around the space where she had been and producing, in due course, entirely different futures from the ones her existence had briefly made possible. The violet in the prayer book broke at the stalk. The rest of the story is silence. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.